Today on Timeless Headlines, we talk about the 1980s and what that meant for video games as a whole, whether it was in the arcade or on a home console, or in some cases even with a PC. There would be booms, busts, innovation, and everything in between, and at the end of the decade, two styles of video games would reign supreme, both from Nintendo. But before we talk about all of that, a word from today's sponsor. In order to get a better understanding of the landscape that was video games in the 1980s, we'll start with the golden age of video games. Then we'll discuss the fissures in the industry and what is widely considered the worst video game of all time. Then we'll discuss the great video game crash of 1983. Following that, we'll discuss how Nintendo brought the industry back from the brink. And right before we get to the conclusion, we'll talk about video games at the end of the 1980s. I'm Jack, this is Timeless Headlines, let's get into it.
And now for something completely different.
While the home console market was growing at a steady clip, arcades were still king when it came to video games. The early 1980s would be the definitive golden age for the video game arcade. It's estimated that at its peak in 1981, there were 24,000 arcades in the United States with 1.5 million machines in operation. The early 80s would also see the debut of several titles that would become cornerstones of the video game industry. In 1980, a game called Pac-Man was released in arcades in Japan. It grew modestly at first, but in less than a year, it would make its way to the United States. It would receive a name change, however, as both Namco, the Japanese developer who made the game, and Midway, the Chicago-based American distributor, did not want graffiti artists to take liberties with its title. There would also be changes to the way the game was played, as the difficulty, speed, and art on the side of the machine were all changed. And while Pac-Man wasn't the first title to have different versions of the game for the Japanese and American markets, it's important to point out. This trend will only continue as we move through the history of video games, as Japanese consumers and consumers in the West have different tastes and preferences. And companies, whether they were American or Japanese, took note and designed their games accordingly. Now, chances are you're probably already familiar with the format of Pac-Man. Yellowhead eats white balls.
What did he say?
To score points, all while avoiding the ghosts that are chasing him. This game was revolutionary for a number of reasons. It was the first game to feature a power-up when Pac-Man would eat one of the bigger white balls,
What did you say, punk?
he would flip the script and be able to hurt the ghosts instead of the other way around. It was the first game to feature AI that was specific to the characters that it applied to. The red and pink ghosts would chase Pac-Man in the most direct way possible, the blue ghost would try to set ambushes, and the orange ghost was randomized. Lastly, and I did not know this prior to the making of this video, Pac-Man introduced cutscenes that were animated mini-movies in between levels. This provided players with a palate cleanser, but what it did more than anything else was to give a sense of story and stakes to this now iconic game. The introduction of these dramatic cutscenes was nothing short of revolutionary in the world of video games. What had previously been a contest purely of skill, not unlike carnival games, now had become a piece of bona fide storytelling. Pac-Man would do so well in the United States that it would surpass Space Invaders in sales. Now, Space Invaders had held the title of the best-selling arcade video game since its release in 1978. But the Pac-Man brand wasn't done innovating. Namco and Midway would follow up their smashing success with Miss Pac-Man in 1981. The gameplay wasn't what made Miss Pac-Man groundbreaking, as it was more or less the exact same as the original. Miss Pac-Man is one of the most influential and important games of all time because it was the first video game ever released with a woman consumer in mind.
You're just a woman with a small brain, with a brain a third the size of us. It's science.
But Pac-Man wasn't the only big game to come out of the arcade-crazed early 1980s. Far from it. The legendary Nintendo did not want to miss out on the hype of the era, so they tasked Shigeru Miyamoto, a young graphic artist with the company, with revamping an underperforming game, Radar Scope, that they had just shipped to the US. The project was so important to the company that the president at the time, the legendary Hiroshi Yamauchi, would directly see the game's redevelopment. Borrowing heavily from the themes in Popeye the Sailor Man, Miyamoto, Yamauchi, and Nintendo gave us Donkey Kong in 1981. When Nintendo couldn't obtain the license to use the Popeye cartoon characters, they got creative and came up with their own. Like Pac-Man from the year prior, Donkey Kong would also revolutionize video game design culture. Donkey Kong is considered by many as the definitive platformer. Now, what is a platformer? Merriam-Webster defines a platformer as, quote, a video game where the play is primarily focused on moving past obstacles in real time with one's avatar by using various abilities, such as jumping and climbing, and items, such as weapons. And as you can see, Donkey Kong did just that. A testament to how elegant Donkey Kong's game design was is the fact that platformers as a genre are still extremely popular today. And there were still even more titles that would become household names. There was Galaga, Frogger, Missile Command, Centipede, and Tempest, just to name a few. After a slump in sales in the late 1970s, Atari thought they had found a winning formula to support its home console, the Atari 2600. It would sometimes partner with third-party developers or develop games in-house to either create new games for the console or to adapt popular arcade games for the 2600 itself. By casting a wide net, they ensured that they were coming out with as many games as possible, even if the quality was not always there. But in a trend that had continued from the 1970s, as you'll remember in our last video, while there were some standouts, there were plenty of low-quality, poorly made games. Atari would also face more competition than it ever had before. Another company, Coleco, would come out with their own home entertainment console, the ColecoVision. In just their first year alone, they would capture 17% of the computer hardware market share. And to add to the situation, in 1982, more home video game consoles would be released than had ever been in a single year, which only further saturated the market. As with any other history, with any other subject, it's important to highlight the good and bad in order to understand the whole picture. We're going to take a minute and discuss what is widely acknowledged to be the worst video game of all time. Steven Spielberg was creating merchandise as a way of promoting his new movie, E.T., and looked to the invincible Atari to create a movie tie-in game. Given that the project was such a big opportunity, Atari tasked Scott Warshaw with designing the game. Warshaw was riding high after making the Raiders of the Lost Ark tie-in game, which Spielberg thought was a faithful adaptation of the movie. But as in so many other times throughout history, such as the fall of the Han Dynasty in China and Napoleon's failed invasion of Russia, the failure that was E.T. was caused by so many factors. To start, there were only 6 weeks to program the entire game.
You what?
Which even with a team of developers would be extremely difficult. I say even with, because Warshaw was the game's only programmer. To make matters worse, Atari was in a tight financial position after losing market share to the home computer market, with home computers such as the Commodore 64. This only added to the frantic nature and rushed way that the game was developed in. Given how big the movie was, Atari would make 1 million more copies of the game than what they would actually need. And lastly, and probably the biggest reason why this game is so infamous, is because the gameplay was absolutely awful. There was no end to the game. You would literally just play until you died. And the objectives would be randomly spawned into random places at random moments. There was no way you could figure out this game. And I have yet to encounter a single interview of any person talking about this where they say they actually enjoyed playing this game. The game sold so badly that Atari would dump unsold units in a landfill in New Mexico.
That is one big pile of shit.
Yes, that is a real thing. Yes, that actually happened. This game's Christmas 1982 release would begin what in the US would become to be known as the video game crash of 1983. And what would come to be known, ironically, in Japan as the Atari shock, which foreshadowed what was to come.
Said on Friday, this thought took a while to thaw, it's going to take a while to unthaw.
While there was innovation in the 80s early years, the overwhelming majority of these games were low quality and in some cases blatant rip-offs of other games. This trend was also true for home consoles, which had seen a deluge of technologically awful consoles be released about the same time, and sometimes by the same publisher. All of this would result in the video game industry's massive crash of 1983. This crash wiped out billions of dollars in value from multiple companies in today's money. The home video game market's revenue in the United States is estimated to have been about $3.2 billion in 1983 dollars. That is $10.2 billion adjusted for inflation in 2024 dollars. At its lowest point, the market had shrunk by an eye-watering 97%, leaving it with a value of $100 million in 1985. And again, adjusting for inflation, that's $293 million in 2024 dollars. Unfortunately, arcades would not be spared this apocalyptic decline. The crash would cause many arcades to close their doors for good. In 1983 alone, over 2,000 arcades would close and never reopen. In 1982, the global arcade market peaked with an estimated revenue of just over 25 billion US dollars. The very next year, that same revenue would decline 20%. It would decline until bottoming out to under 10 billion US dollars in 1985. Arcade video games would never enjoy the financial success, cultural zeitgeist, or market share that they once had ever again. Even the mighty Atari wasn't spared from this huge market decline when it lost $500 million in value and was ultimately sold by its parent company, Time Warner. Atari would also share the fate of the arcade industry, as it would go on to be just a shadow of its former self. Many remarked that video games were just a passing fad, as the industry had supernovaed in just 10 years. The great video game crash of 1983 can be attributed to three main factors. First, there was a flooded home console market. Second, there were too many games made with little to no quality control that were all relatively the same. And last and third, there was competition from the home computer market. And while video games may have had their boom and bust period in the early 1980s, the industry as a whole was very much here to stay. As in so many other cases, the collapse of American dominance in any industry opened the door for Asian, and in this case specifically Japanese companies, to dominate in the 1980s.
Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
Nintendo had a healthy arcade game and home console business, but they didn't stop there when it came to diversifying. Nintendo would also release one of the very first handheld portable video game systems, what would come to be known as the Game & Watch handheld series. These consoles were released from 1980 through 1991. There were 2 games usually on each system, and while they didn't make any legendary titles like some of their other systems would give us, it was an important step forward in bringing video games to even more people. And a quick fun fact about this console series: its inclusion of the directional pad, or D-pad as it's colloquially known now, is why every physical controller since has had a up, down, left, right pad on it in some way, shape, or form. And because Nintendo was so diversified in their business approach to video games, they didn't suffer the same financial constraints as other companies did. On July 15th, 1983, Nintendo released the Famicom, their next generation home console. One of the biggest selling points of the Famicom was its ability to play the popular games such as Donkey Kong. Even at the height of the video game crash, this console did very well in Japan. It did so well that the console began to be imported to the US in 1985, but under a different name. The name? The Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. This system sold so miraculously well that games would be made for it all the way until 1994. While there were a number of games released on this system, there were 2 that stood out compared to others and would be the industry standard for how to make video games for the remainder of the 1980s. The first game we'll discuss is the legendary Super Mario Bros., released in 1983 in Japan and 1985 in the United States. While Donkey Kong invented the platform style of video games, Super Mario Bros. Perfected it. The game had the classic Mario story: rescue kidnapped princess by jumping over or on things. It would also be the first video game where Mario was called Mario, not Jumpman like he was in Donkey Kong. And because this game would be packaged with the Nintendo Entertainment System, Nintendo knew it had to be good. Nintendo's Yamauchi, who you'll remember from earlier, is quoted as saying, "Great games sell great consoles," when discussing the game with his team. The other game that would become extremely important to not just the history of Nintendo, but the history of the entire video game industry was The Legend of Zelda. It was released in 1986 in Japan and 1987 in the United States. Much in the same way that Donkey Kong pioneered the platformer genre, The Legend of Zelda would allow players to explore an open world in a way that with home consoles had never been done before. The player had to manage inventory, upgrade items in order to advance, and search for whatever else was needed. While that system might sound basic today, it was cutting edge for console games when the game was released in 1986. This game also had you saving your princess, but this time you were left-handed, and the bad guy was a magician instead of you being a plumber and the bad guy being a dragon. Both of these games also made music a key component of what made them great. Koji Kondo composed the soundtracks for both of these legendary games, and it really gave the games a true cinematic quality. But Nintendo wasn't finished doing things that would change the entire landscape of the video game market. It would also place licensing controls that would ensure no unlicensed games would be playable on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This now industry standard ensured that quantity and quality of games would hit certain thresholds and therefore not flood the market to cause another crash. As video games moved into the late 80s, they began to appeal to a wider and wider audience. There were sequels to established franchises like Super Mario Bros. 2 and 3. There were games that established new franchises like Metroid, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy. There were games that presented new art styles and better graphics like Prince of Persia, Rad Racer, and Ninja Garden. There was Tetris. And in a sign that video games had become mainstream, John Madden himself made his own football game. Although the NFL would not yet allow for the game to use their teams, the name recognition alone of John Madden was enough to get people to buy the game. And ever since its release in 1988, there has been a new game in the series every single year. Well, Atari had its Atari 7800, which was released in 1985. And Sega first had its Master System, released in 1985 as well, and then the Sega Genesis in 1988. The 1980s would go down as the era dominated by Nintendo. As a sign of things to come, Nintendo would release its first true handheld console just before the end of the decade in 1989, when they came out with the Game Boy. Nintendo knew just how strong the handheld market was, and no small part due to the success of their Game & Watch consoles. And before we get to our conclusion part of this video, I wanted to take a minute and show off some best-selling games that came from the later half of the 1980s. Enjoy. The 1980s were an age of change for the entire video game industry. And while the home console market would not surpass the arcade video game market until 1997, their revenue streams were becoming bigger and bigger with each passing year. The video games themselves fell into two camps. They were either platformer, like Donkey Kong or Mario, or they were an adventure fantasy game, like The Legend of Zelda. Now, there were simulation games like SimCity and Microsoft Flight Simulator, but those hadn't really quite become mainstream yet. So the industry had a long way to go before it became what we know today. However, I will say though, there were the foundations that would build our modern day video game industry that were being established during this time. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Really appreciate all the support. And then if you really enjoyed it, please come check us out on Patreon. We'd really appreciate your support there as well. As always, I'm Jack, and this is Timeless Headlines.